the soft sound of the wind, the golden field at sunset. A farmer walks slowly, his worn hat shading a distant, thoughtful gaze. Years ago, he sold his bull for just $1. It was just business, nothing more. But fate has a curious way of testing the human heart. When their eyes met again, the silence spoke louder than 1,000 words. In that moment, the past returned, and what happened next melted hearts across the country. True love never forgets. Jim Walker stood in the doorway of his barn, watching the bank appraiser walk his property with a clipboard, calculating the value of everything Jim had spent 20 years building: his farm, his livelihood, his life. It was 2014, and the drought had been merciless. 3 years of failed crops, cattle dying from lack of water, debts piling up faster than he could count. The bank had been patient, until they weren't. Now they were foreclosing, and Jim had 30 days to liquidate everything before they took it all. "Mr. Walker," the appraiser called out, "I need to assess the livestock." Jim's jaw tightened. The livestock. 18 cattle left from a herd that had once numbered 80. Most had been sold off over the past 2 years, desperate attempts to pay mounting bills. These last 18 were all that remained. Among them was Red. Red was a Hereford bull, 10 years old, with a distinctive reddish-brown coat and a white face marked by a scar over his left eye. A reminder of the day Jim had saved him from barbed wire when he was just a calf. Red had been born on this farm, raised by Jim's own hands when his mother rejected him. For 10 years, Red had been more than livestock. He'd been a companion, a reminder of better times, a living connection to the farm Jim loved. "The bull's too old for breeding stock," the appraiser said, making notes. "Market value for beef would be around $800, but given his age and condition, you'd be lucky to get $500 at auction." Jim felt something break inside him. $500. That's what Red's life was worth to strangers, to the market, to everyone who didn't know what that bull meant. "I'm not selling him for beef," Jim said quietly. The appraiser looked up, surprised. "Mr. Walker, you need every dollar you can get. Sentiment won't pay your debts. I know that." But Jim couldn't do it. Couldn't send Red to slaughter after everything they'd been through together. There had to be another way. That evening, Jim sat on his porch with his daughter Emily, who'd driven 3 hours from Topeka when she heard about the foreclosure. "Dad, you can't save them all," Emily said gently. She was 26, practical, worried about her father's refusal to face reality. "The bank is taking the farm. You need to accept that and start over." "I know." Jim's voice was hollow. "But Red, I can't send him to auction. Can't watch someone buy him for meat." "Then what will you do?" Jim had been thinking about that all day. "Frank Morrison, you remember him? Your old friend from the co-op? He retired last year, bought a small place near Lawrence, has 20 acres, keeps a few animals. He's always said if I needed anything." Jim trailed off. "I could ask if he'd take Red, not for breeding, not for anything, just to let him live out his days. Would he do that? Take on a 10-year-old bull for free? I don't know, but I have to ask." Jim called Frank that night. The conversation was difficult, admitting failure, begging for help, laying bare just how far he'd fallen. But Frank listened without judgment. "I can take him," Frank said finally. "I've got space, and I could use a bull to keep my small herd company. But Jim, I can't pay you for him. Money's tight for me too." "I don't want money," Jim said. "I just want him safe, want him to have a home." "Then he's got one. When do you want to bring him over?" Jim thought about the 30-day deadline, about the assessors who would be back next week to finalize the inventory. "Tomorrow, before the bank takes everything." There was a long pause. "Jim, you don't have to explain. I'll be ready." That night, Jim walked out to the pasture where Red stood under the stars, grazing peacefully. The bull lifted his head when Jim approached, making that low, rumbling sound of recognition he'd made since he was a calf. "Hey, boy," Jim said softly, running his hand along Red's neck. "Got some news. You're leaving tomorrow?" Going to Frank's place. He's got good land, clean water. You'll be taken care of. Red pushed his massive head against Jim's chest, the way he always did when seeking attention. I'm sorry I couldn't keep you, Jim continued, his voice breaking. I tried. God knows I tried. But I'm losing everything, and I can't watch you go to slaughter. This is the only way I can protect you. He pulled a crumpled dollar bill from his pocket, the only cash he had left after paying for gas to make tomorrow's trip. This is what I'm selling you for. $1. Not because that's what you're worth, but because I need the transaction to be legal. Need proof I sold you before the bank takes inventory. Jim pressed his forehead against Red's, tears falling freely now. You've been a good friend, the best, and I'm going to miss you every single day. Red rumbled again, and Jim could have sworn the old bull understood. The next morning, Jim loaded Red into the trailer, a process that usually took 20 minutes of coaxing. But today, Red walked up the ramp without hesitation, as if he sensed this was important, as if he trusted Jim completely. The drive to Frank Morrison's farm took 2 hours. Jim drove slowly, checking the rearview mirror constantly, watching Red stand calmly in the trailer. Emily rode with him, silent, knowing her father needed space to grieve. Frank's property was modest but beautiful, rolling hills, a small pond, good fencing. When they unloaded Red, the bull surveyed his new surroundings with calm curiosity. He'll do fine here, Frank assured Jim. I promise you he'll be treated well. Jim nodded, unable to speak. He handed Frank the dollar bill and a handwritten bill of sale. This makes it official. You own him now. Jim, no. This way, the bank can't touch him. He's yours. Safe. Frank pocketed the dollar without argument, understanding the weight of the gesture. Jim spent 20 minutes saying goodbye. He checked Red's hooves, ran his hands over the bull's coat one last time, whispered things Emily couldn't hear. Finally, he stepped back. Take care of him, Jim said to Frank. I will. And Jim? When you get back on your feet, you're welcome to visit any time. Jim nodded, not trusting his voice, and walked back to his truck. As they pulled away, he looked in the side mirror and saw Red standing at the fence watching them go. The bank took the farm 3 weeks later. Everything Jim owned went to auction: equipment, remaining cattle, the land his grandfather had homesteaded in 1947. Jim and Emily stood and watched strangers bid on the pieces of his life, buying them for pennies on the dollar. When it was over, Jim had nothing. He moved into a small apartment in Wichita, took a job at a feed supply store, and tried to figure out how to start over at 42 years old. But he thought about Red every day. Wondered if the bull remembered him. Wondered if he'd made the right choice. Wondered if Frank was keeping his promise. He never called to check. Part of him was afraid to know. Afraid that asking would somehow jinx the one good thing he'd managed to do in the wreckage of his life: saving Red. 10 years passed. Jim was 52 now, weathered by a decade of hard work and harder lessons. He'd saved money slowly, lived frugally, never remarried after his wife left during the foreclosure. His life was small, contained, lonely, but he'd survived. And after 10 years, he'd saved enough for a down payment on a small farm, nothing like what he'd lost, but 20 acres near Lawrence. Enough to have a few animals, grow some crops, feel like a farmer again. The realtor showing him properties mentioned a neighbor selling equipment. Frank Morrison, nice guy. Retiring for real this time, moving to Arizona for his health. You should meet him. Might be good to know your neighbors. Jim's heart stopped. Frank Morrison. Yeah, you know him. I used to. That evening, Jim drove to Frank's property, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He hadn't seen Frank in 10 years, hadn't asked about Red, hadn't let himself hope. Frank answered the door, older and grayer, but still recognizable. His eyes widened in surprise. Jim Walker, I'll be damned. Frank. Jim's throat was tight. I heard you're moving. Yeah. Doctor says the dry air in Arizona will be better for my lungs. Selling everything, heading out next month. Frank studied Jim's face. You hear about equipment or something else? Jim couldn't ask. The words stuck in his throat. Frank smiled, understanding. He's still here, Jim. In the back pasture. 13 years old now, moving slower but still strong. Still here. Can I? Jim couldn't finish. Of course. Come on. They walked together through the twilight, toward the back pasture where an old Hereford bull grazed peacefully in the golden light. Jim stopped at the fence and his breath caught. Red lifted his head, looked directly at him, and for a moment, neither moved. 10 years. A decade since Jim had touched him, spoken to him, seen him. And then Red made a sound. That low, rumbling call Jim hadn't heard since the day he'd said goodbye. Recognition. Memory. Love. Red didn't just recognize Jim. He moved. The old bull, 13 years old and slower than he'd been in his prime, broke into a trot. Then a run. His massive body moving with surprising speed across the pasture, heading straight for the fence where Jim stood frozen in disbelief. "Jim, step back," Frank warned. "He's moving fast." But Jim didn't move. He gripped the fence rail, tears already streaming down his face, watching this bull he'd sold for $1 10 years ago, charging toward him like no time had passed at all. Red reached the fence and stopped just short, his momentum controlled, his movements deliberate despite his urgency. He pressed his massive head over the top rail, reaching for Jim, making that rumbling sound over and over, not aggressive, but insistent, desperate almost. I remember you. Where have you been?" Jim's hands reached up, trembling, touching Red's face. The scar over his left eye was still there, faded but visible. His coat was grayer around the muzzle, his movements stiffer, but his eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, held the same recognition they always had. "Red," Jim choked out. "Oh God, Red, you remember me." The bull pushed harder against Jim's hands, his entire body pressing against the fence, trying to get closer. He made sounds Jim had almost forgotten. The low rumbles, the gentle snorts, the way he'd breathe heavily when content. Frank stood back, wiping his own eyes. "He's never done that. Not once in 10 years. He's friendly enough, but he's never—" "Jim, he's been waiting for you." Jim climbed over the fence, protocol and safety be damned, and Red immediately wrapped his massive head around Jim's body, nearly knocking him over. It was the same gesture he'd done as a calf, when he was small enough that it was cute. Now, at nearly 2,000 pounds, it was overwhelming. But Jim didn't care. He wrapped his arms around Red's thick neck, burying his face in the bull's coat, and sobbed. "I'm sorry," Jim said over and over. "I'm so sorry I left you. I didn't want to. I had to. I'm so sorry." Red stood perfectly still, letting Jim hold him, his rumbling never stopping. A sound of contentment, of reunion, of forgiveness for an abandonment the bull had never understood but had clearly never forgotten. They stayed like that for 20 minutes. Jim talking, Red listening, both of them processing a decade of separation in the failing light of a Kansas evening. Finally, Frank spoke gently. "Jim, I need to tell you something about Red." Jim looked up, fear gripping him. "What's wrong? Is he sick?" "No, nothing like that. He's healthy for his age, but—" Frank hesitated. "I'm moving to Arizona. I can't take him. He's too old to transport that far, and honestly, the heat there wouldn't be good for him." Jim's stomach dropped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I need to find him a home. I've been dreading it, putting it off. I promised you I'd take care of him, and I have. But I can't anymore. And I've been trying to figure out what to do." "I'll take him," Jim said immediately. "I'm buying property near here, 20 acres. It's not much, but it's enough for him. I'll take him back." "Jim, can you afford—" "I don't care what it costs. He's mine. He was always mine. I only gave him up because I had to. Now I can give him back what I took." Jim's voice was fierce. "How much do you want for him?" Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, faded dollar bill, the same one Jim had given him 10 years ago. He'd kept it all this time, pressed in his wallet. $1, Frank said, handing it back to Jim. "Same as you sold him for. You gave him to me to keep him safe. Now I'm giving him back so you can finish what you started." Jim stared at the dollar bill, then at Frank, unable to speak. He's been waiting for you, Jim, all these years. I think he knew you'd come back. Frank smiled. Animals understand loyalty better than we do sometimes. He never forgot you. 2 weeks later, Jim closed on his 20-acre farm. It wasn't much. A small house needing repairs, a barn with a leaking roof, fencing that needed work. But it was his. And more importantly, it was Red's home. The day he moved Red to the new property, Jim drove the trailer himself, taking the same route he'd taken a decade earlier in the opposite direction. This time, though, he wasn't crying. He was smiling. When they arrived and lowered the trailer ramp, Red walked out calmly, surveying the property with what Jim swore was approval. Jim led him to the main pasture, 5 acres of good grass, a stock tank for water, a shelter from weather. "This is it, boy," Jim said, removing the lead rope. "This is home, our home, and I promise you, I will never let you go again. Never." Red stood for a moment, then did something that made Jim laugh through tears. The old bull kicked up his back legs and trotted around the pasture like a youngster, exploring every corner, claiming his territory. "Still got some spirit in you," Jim called out, grinning. That night, Jim slept in his new house, unfurnished except for a sleeping bag and pillow, and woke at dawn to check on Red. The bull was standing at the fence nearest the house, waiting. When he saw Jim, he rumbled that familiar greeting. Jim walked out, climbed the fence, and sat beside Red as the sun rose over Kansas farmland. "We made it," Jim said quietly. "Lost everything. Spent 10 years apart. But we made it back to each other." Red leaned his massive head against Jim's shoulder, and they watched the sunrise together. Word spread quickly through the rural Kansas community. The farmer who'd lost everything and the bull he'd sold for $1 reunited after 10 years. Local newspapers picked up the story, then regional news, then national. A reporter from the Kansas City Star came to interview Jim. "People want to know, why a bull? Why was this animal so important that you spent a decade thinking about him?" Jim considered the question carefully. "Red was born on my family's farm. His mother rejected him, so I bottle-fed him, stayed up nights when he was sick, taught him to trust humans. When I lost the farm, I lost my grandfather's legacy, my livelihood, my marriage, my sense of purpose. But I couldn't lose Red, too. Selling him to Frank for $1 was the only way I could protect one thing, just one thing, from the wreckage. And now? Now I've got a second chance. Not at the big farm I used to have. I'll never have that again. But at something smaller, simpler. And Red's here with me. That's all I need." The story resonated. Donations started arriving. People sending checks to help Jim repair his barn, buy equipment, stock his farm. Strangers wrote letters saying Red's story had reminded them of their own losses, their own efforts to hold on to what mattered. One letter came from Emily, Jim's daughter. "Dad, I'm proud of you. Not because you got Red back, but because you never gave up on what mattered. Love you." Jim kept that letter in his wallet, right next to the dollar bill Frank had returned. 6 months after the reunion, Jim's farm was functional. Not prosperous, but sustainable. He'd acquired 3 cows, some chickens, and planted a small crop. It was modest, but it was enough. Red became a fixture in the community. People drove by to see the famous bull, and Jim always welcomed them, telling Red's story, explaining why this animal mattered so much. "He's not just a bull," Jim would say. "He's a reminder that love, real love, doesn't forget. That sometimes the things we lose find their way back to us. That loyalty goes both ways, even between a man and an animal." One afternoon, a young farmer came by, struggling with his own financial troubles, facing foreclosure on his family's farm. "I don't know what to do," the young man admitted. "The bank's taking everything." Jim listened, then walked him out to Red's pasture. "See that bull? I sold him for $1 to save him from slaughter. Spent 10 years thinking I'd never see him again. But I worked, I saved. And when the moment came, fate gave us both a second chance." "You think I'll get a second chance?" "I think if you hold on to what matters, really matters, and you don't give up, then yes. Maybe not the way you expect, maybe not on your timeline. But yes. Jim looked at Red, grazing peacefully. That bull taught me that some bonds don't break, no matter how much time passes. Remember that when things get dark. The young farmer left with tears in his eyes, and something that looked like hope. That evening, Jim sat on his porch with Red grazing nearby, visible through the fence. The Kansas sky painted itself in oranges and purples, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang. Jim thought about everything he'd lost, the big farm, the marriage, the easy prosperity he'd once known. And he thought about what he'd gained, this small piece of land, this old bull, this quiet contentment. He'd trade none of it. We made it, Red, Jim called out. Against all odds, we made it. Red lifted his head, looked directly at Jim, and rumbled that sound, the one that meant understanding, that meant home, that meant love, never forgotten. Jim's story reached farther than anyone expected. A video went viral, shot by a visitor to the farm, showing Red trotting across the pasture when he heard Jim's voice, pressing his head against Jim's chest in their daily greeting ritual. 20 million views in 3 days. Comments poured in from around the world. I'm crying at my desk. This is what loyalty looks like. If a bull can remember after 10 years, what excuse do we have for giving up on people we love? The attention was overwhelming. Jim, who'd spent a decade living quietly, suddenly had reporters calling, documentary producers inquiring, animal welfare organizations wanting to feature his story. But the most meaningful impact came from unexpected places. A woman named Patricia drove 4 hours from Oklahoma to meet Jim. She was in her 60s, tears streaming down her face as she stood at Red's pasture. I gave up my daughter for adoption 40 years ago, Patricia said quietly. Closed adoption. I've thought about her every single day. Your story. Seeing how Red never forgot you. It gave me courage. I hired a search agency. I found her last week. Did you contact her? Jim asked gently. Not yet. I'm terrified. What if she hates me? What if she doesn't want to know me? Jim looked at Red, grazing peacefully. I was terrified too. Terrified Red would have forgotten me, that 10 years was too long. But love doesn't work on timelines. It just exists. Waiting. Patricia nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you for sharing your story, for showing me that some bonds survive everything. 2 months later, Jim received a letter from Patricia. She'd contacted her daughter. They'd met. It was complicated and emotional, but they were building a relationship. Red gave me hope when I had none, she wrote. Tell him thank you. More visitors came. A veteran who'd lost touch with his military dog after deployment, a divorced father estranged from his teenage son, an elderly man who'd abandoned his family decades ago and was trying to find courage to reach out. Jim welcomed them all, let them meet Red, shared his story without judgment. His small farm became an unlikely pilgrimage site for people carrying regret, loss, and hope. Why do you think they come? A reporter asked during a follow-up interview. Jim thought carefully. Because Red proves that what we love doesn't stop mattering just because time passes, that memory and loyalty are real, that second chances exist. He paused. Most people carry something they lost, a relationship, a dream, a version of themselves. Red reminds them it's not too late to go back for it. The reporter captured Jim standing with Red at sunset, the old bull's head resting on Jim's shoulder. The photo ran on the cover of Farm and Ranch magazine with the headline, Love Never Forgets, the bull and the farmer who found each other again. The young farmer Jim had counseled months earlier returned, this time with news. I saved my farm, sold off assets, downsized, restructured debt. It's smaller now, but it's mine. And I remembered what you said about holding on to what matters. He'd brought his young daughter, maybe 6 years old, who was nervous around the large bull. Red won't hurt you, Jim said gently. Come on, I'll introduce you. The little girl approached cautiously, then giggled when Red made his rumbling sound. He's talking. He is, Jim confirmed. He's saying hello. The girl's father watched with tears in his eyes. I almost gave up, lost everything. But your story, it reminded me why I fight. For her, For the farm that'll be hers someday. He looked at Jim. You saved more than a bull 10 years ago. You saved hope. On Red's 14th birthday, Jim threw a small celebration, just himself, Emily, and Frank Morrison, who'd driven from Arizona to visit. They stood around Red's pasture with a cake, for the humans, and a special bucket of grain and molasses, for Red. To Red, Frank toasted with lemonade. The bull who taught us all what loyalty really means. And to second chances, Emily added, squeezing her father's hand. Jim watched Red enjoy his birthday treat, moving slower now, but still strong, still here. I spent 10 years thinking I'd failed him, failed everyone, lost everything that mattered. But you didn't fail, Frank said. You protected him the only way you could, and you never gave up on finding your way back. Neither did he, Jim said quietly. He waited. 10 years, he waited for me. As the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in impossible colors, Jim realized something profound. He'd lost his grandfather's farm, his marriage, his former life. But he'd gained something more valuable, understanding that worth isn't measured in acres or assets, but in the bonds that survive loss, the love that endures separation, the loyalty that never forgets. You know what the best part is? Jim said. Every morning, I wake up and Red's here, still here. After everything, we get to grow old together. That's all I ever wanted. Emily hugged her father, and Frank clapped him on the shoulder, and Red continued eating his birthday grain, oblivious to the philosophy happening around him, but content in the way only an animal who's finally home can be. The story of Jim and Red had touched millions. But for Jim, it was never about the attention or the inspiration he'd supposedly provided. It was about a promise kept, a bond honored, and a love that proved, against all odds, across a decade of separation, that some things are truly unbreakable. 3 years after their reunion, Red was 16 years old, ancient for a bull. His movements were stiff with arthritis, his breathing heavier, his once powerful frame now gaunt despite Jim's careful feeding. Jim knew what was coming. He'd known for months, watching Red slow down, struggle to stand some mornings, lose interest in food. The vet had been gentle but honest. He's lived a good long life. Bulls rarely make it past 14. 16 is extraordinary. But Jim, his body's failing. It might be time to consider... No, Jim had said firmly. When it's time, I'll know. But I'm not making that choice prematurely. Every morning, Jim walked to Red's pasture first thing, his heart in his throat until he saw the old bull standing, still breathing, still here. And every morning, Red would rumble that greeting, softer now but unmistakable. Still here, still with you. Emily visited more frequently now, worried about her father, knowing what was coming. Dad, you need to prepare yourself. I am prepared, Jim said quietly. I've had 3 bonus years I never thought I'd get. 3 years of mornings and evenings with him. That's more than most people get with what they love. But preparing and accepting were different things. On a cold November morning, Jim found Red lying down in the pasture, unable to rise. His breathing was labored, his eyes glassy with pain. Hey boy, Jim said, kneeling beside him in the frosted grass. You hurting? Red's rumble was weak, but present. Jim called the vet, who came immediately. The examination was brief. His organs are failing, Jim. He's in pain. The kindest thing... I know. Jim's voice broke. I know. The vet left them alone for a few minutes. Jim lay down in the grass beside Red, his arm across the bull's massive neck, his face pressed against the rough coat. You've been the best friend I ever had, Jim whispered. Loyal when I had nothing to give you. Patient through 10 years of waiting. You never forgot me, never stopped loving me, even when I had to leave you. Red made a soft sound, and Jim felt the bull's breath on his face, steady, familiar, fading. I want you to know, selling you for that $1 was the hardest thing I ever did. But getting you back, having these 3 years together, that was the best. You saved me, Red. Not the other way around. You saved me. The vet returned quietly. Jim nodded, unable to speak, his hand on Red's head as the injection was administered. Red's breathing slowed, then stilled. The rumbling stopped, and Jim stayed there, holding his friend, as the morning sun rose over the Kansas prairie one last time with Red in it. They buried Red in the pasture where he'd spent his final years, under the cottonwood tree where he used to rest in the shade. Jim placed a simple marker: Red, loyalty, never forgets. The grief was crushing. Jim had lost the farm, lost his marriage, lost his old life. But losing Red felt different, deeper, because Red had been the one constant through everything, the one relationship untainted by failure or circumstance. For weeks, Jim walked the pasture alone, the silence where Red's rumbling used to be almost unbearable. Emily came to stay, worried about her father's depression. "Dad, you gave him the best life possible. 3 extra years of love and care. That matters." "I know it does," Jim said, "but knowing doesn't make it hurt less." A month after Red's death, letters started arriving. Hundreds of them. People who'd followed the story, who'd been inspired by the reunion, who'd driven hours to meet Red. "Your bull taught me to fight for my marriage. We reconciled after 5 years apart. Thank you. I reconnected with my estranged father because of Red's story. We're speaking again after a decade. Thank you. I adopted a senior dog from a shelter instead of buying a puppy. Red showed me that old doesn't mean disposable. Thank you." Jim read every letter, tears streaming down his face, understanding for the first time the full impact of his story. Red hadn't just been his friend. He'd become a symbol of loyalty, of second chances, of love that endures beyond reason. "He mattered to so many people," Emily said, reading through the letters with him. "He mattered to me most," Jim replied. "But I'm glad others saw what I saw, that he was special, that what we had was worth fighting for." 6 months after Red's death, Jim stood at the cottonwood tree where his friend was buried, placing fresh wildflowers on the grave. Spring had returned to Kansas, bringing green grass and warm winds, but the pasture felt empty without Red's massive presence. A car pulled into the driveway. Visitors were still common, people wanting to pay respects, to hear the story firsthand. Jim had learned to welcome them, understanding that Red's legacy lived on through the lives he'd touched. This visitor was different. A young man in his 20s, nervous, carrying a folder. "Mr. Walker, I'm David Chen. I'm a veterinary student at Kansas State. I wanted to talk to you about Red." Jim invited him in, curious. David opened the folder, revealing documents and photographs. "I'm doing my thesis on animal cognition and long-term memory. Red's story, the way he recognized you after 10 years, it's extraordinary. Bulls aren't known for that kind of sustained emotional memory." "Red was special," Jim said simply. "He was, and his story inspired my research. I've been documenting cases of livestock showing complex emotional bonds and memory retention. Because of Red, the veterinary community is starting to recognize that cattle are far more emotionally sophisticated than we've given them credit for." David pulled out more papers. "Several universities are now funding studies on animal-human bonds in agricultural settings. Red's story became the catalyst. He's changing how we understand and treat livestock." Jim felt tears sting his eyes. Red's impact extended even beyond the personal stories. He was changing science, education, the way people saw animals. "There's something else," David continued. "A group of us want to establish a scholarship in Red's name, for veterinary students specializing in large animal welfare and cognition. We'd like your permission to use his story." "Yes," Jim said immediately. "Red would have loved that, helping others even after he's gone." That summer, Jim attended the first Red Memorial Scholarship ceremony at Kansas State. 5 students received funding, each committed to improving livestock welfare and understanding animal cognition. "Red taught us that animals don't just survive. They feel, remember, love," one recipient said in her acceptance speech. "This scholarship will help us honor that truth in our careers." Jim stood in the audience, Emily beside him, watching these young people commit to carrying Red's legacy forward. The bull who'd been sold for $1 had become a symbol of something profound, the recognition that all creatures deserve dignity, memory, and love. Back at the farm, Jim had made changes. He'd adopted 3 older cattle from a rescue, animals deemed too old for production, destined for slaughter. They grazed in Red's pasture now, living out their final years in peace. Red taught me that age doesn't diminish worth, Jim explained to visitors. These cattle have given years of service. They deserve to rest, not die because they're no longer profitable. He'd named the program Red's Sanctuary, and donations allowed him to accept more animals. His small farm became a refuge for livestock society had discarded, each one living proof of Red's lesson, that love, loyalty, and life itself had value beyond economics. On what would have been Red's 17th birthday, Jim organized a memorial gathering. Hundreds came, people whose lives Red had touched, families who'd reconciled because of his story, farmers who'd changed how they treated their animals. Frank Morrison, now 80 and frail, made the trip from Arizona. "That dollar I took from you 10 years ago," he said, pulling the worn bill from his wallet. "I want you to have it back. Frame it. Remember what it represents. A sacrifice that became a miracle." Jim took the dollar, tears streaming down his face. Red was worth so much more than this. "I know. But this dollar represents something priceless. The choice to protect what you love, even when it costs everything. That's what changed people, Jim. Not the reunion itself, but your refusal to give up on something that mattered." That evening, Jim sat alone at Red's grave, watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in golds and purples. "I miss you every single day," Jim said to the simple marker. "But I understand now what you gave me. Not just companionship, not just loyalty. You gave me purpose. Showed me that love endures, that sacrifice matters, that the bonds we build are stronger than the circumstances that test them." A soft breeze rustled through the cottonwood leaves, and Jim imagined Red's rumble in that sound. Content, peaceful, eternal. "Thank you, old friend," Jim whispered. "For waiting, for remembering, for teaching the world that some things, some love, truly never forgets." The sun dipped below the horizon, and Jim stood, touching the marker one last time before walking back to his small farmhouse. Red's sanctuary waited. Animals who needed the same grace Red had received, the same second chance, the same recognition that every life mattered. Jim had sold a bull for $1 to save him from slaughter. That bull had waited 10 years and recognized him instantly. Their reunion had touched millions of hearts and changed countless lives. But the real miracle wasn't the impossible reunion or the viral fame. It was the simple, profound truth Red had embodied, that true love, whether between humans or between a man and an animal, never forgets, never stops waiting, and never stops mattering. Jim smiled through his tears, feeling Red's presence in the wind, in the grass, in the animals grazing peacefully in the sanctuary built in his honor. "We made it, Red," Jim said to the evening sky, "and your story will live forever." Years later, the farmer met the bull he sold for $1, and what happened melted hearts.